I apologize for giving a speech about the future of work and technology from the lowest phi solution possible, which is a music stand and reading off a piece of paper. It feels like it could be 1910 or something. I'm going to predict the future of the Model T. So I'm here officially to talk about the future of work, but rather than begin with an explicit prediction, I want to begin with a bit of humility. The future sometimes seems, to many journalists and many writers, like something that can be extrapolated, something that can be guessed and predicted with a degree of scientific certainty. But the future, indeed the distant future in particular, is chaos, literal chaos. It is impossible, for example, for even the best meteorologists to accurately forecast the weather any more than 7 to 10 days in the future. There are so many factors that influence the weather, temperature and pressure and rain, that although it's easy to predict the very next day's temperature and precipitation, it's basically impossible to do so for a month in the future because you're dealing with all these different factors influencing each other. And so what you're essentially predicting is a weather system that bears no resemblance to one that you can see outside. The future is another world entirely. You can look at it without actually seeing it. You can calculate it without truly measuring it. The future is a stranger. It has certainly been a stranger to past economists trying to make similar predictions to mine. There's a famous 1930 essay by the economist John Maynard Keynes, Economic Possibilities of Our Children, that made the famous forecast that in the 21st century, the work week would be 15 hours long. He said the chief social challenge of this future would be the difficulty of managing all of our abundant leisure time. I am quoting now. For the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his permanent problem. How to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which science and compound interest, thank you, compound interest, will have won for him to live wisely and agreeably and well. But 70 years later, it seems far more true to say that it is not leisure that defines the lives of so many Americans. It is work. Rich, college-educated men and women now work longer than they did 30 years ago. Work leaks into our private lives. We sleep within arm's length of our phones. We feel phantom buzzes on our thighs. That's the nervous system jittering to stay attached to our digital Rolodex. Writers and economists from half a century ago and longer anticipated that the future would buy leisure for wealthy workers in America, but instead it seems to have just bought more work. Several weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal published a very widely shared essay about the most productive hour of the day. It was 4 a.m. She quoted entrepreneurs and lawyers and career coaches and co-founders who praised the spiritual sanctity of these pre-dawn hours. They said that the office had become too distracting to actually do work, so instead work itself had apparently had to come at the expense of sleep. So Keynes envisioned a life with a little less work and a little more leisure, not a social competition to see who could maximize their pre-dawn productivity, but a 2016 essay about why Americans should sleep less appeals specifically to a readership that considers downtime to be a worthy sacrifice upon the altar of productivity. But America today is not all 4 a.m. consultants. One of the great lessons of Tuesday is that there is a deep and growing divide between the lives and networks of college-educated Americans and the lives and networks of Americans who didn't go to college, who are concentrated in particular around the Rust Belt and the Great Lakes. Which is interesting because to report the article that David talked about last year, I went to Youngstown, Ohio. And there's several things to know about Youngstown if you don't already. First, this city is in Ohio, the bellwether state of all bellwether states. It exists as a kind of political equilibrium. In the larger Mahoning County, where Youngstown is, only 50,000 votes, or only 5,000 votes, separated the two candidates. Second, Youngstown was once the single richest city in the U.S. in the 1950s, a hallmark of union membership and manufacturing strength. But as manufacturing shifted abroad after World War II, Youngstown steel suffered. It was one precise month, September in 1977, when one of its largest factories, the Campbell Works Mill, shut down. And within 5 years, the city lost 50,000 jobs, $1.3 billion in manufacturing wages. The effect was so severe that economists had to make up a new term to describe the fallout. They called it a regional depression. Youngstown was transformed not only by an economic disruption, but also by a psychological and cultural breakdown. Depression, spousal abuse, and suicide all increased. The city built 4 prisons in the 1990s, making prison construction one of the area's few growth industries. When somebody told me this fact, I couldn't help but think that this city that was once united by the manufacturing of metal beams had now been divided by those very same metal beams as they had been converted into prison bars. In the past few years, even as the United States has pulled out of the Great Recession, some economists and technologists have warned that the economy itself is near a tipping point. Youngstown writ large, the end of work for many of today's workers. They see automation high and low, robots in the operation room and behind the fast food counter. They imagine self-driving cars snaking through the streets and Amazon drones dotting the skies, replacing millions of drivers, warehouse stockers, and retail workers. They observe that the capabilities of these machines, already formidable, continue to expand exponentially while our own remain the same. Technology increasing at Moore's law, humans increasing at Darwin's. And they wonder, is any job truly safe? Futurists and science fiction writers have at times looked forward to machines' workplace turnover with a kind of giddy excitement, imagining the banishment of drudgery and its replacement by expansive leisure and almost limitless personal freedom. But even leaving aside questions of how to distribute this wealth, the widespread disappearance of work would usher in a social transformation unlike anything we've seen. Because industriousness has served as America's unofficial religion since its founding. The sanctity and preeminence of work lie at the heart of the country's politics, economics, and social interactions. What would happen if this went away? Historians, I think, make the best futurists. So let's go back to the beginning of this story to predict the future. The US labor force has been shaped by millennia of technological progress. For most of US history, we worked in fields and in barns. 150 years ago, 90% of American workers were farmers. But the Industrial Revolution moved people into factories, and then globalization and technology moved people back out, giving rise to a land of services. Throughout these reshufflings, the total number of jobs has always increased. But what may be looming is something different, an era of technological unemployment. That is, a period when the total number of jobs declines because technology, whether it's automation or robots, software, and all of its brethren, turn out to be better at work than we are. In 2013, Oxford University researchers forecast that machines might be able to perform half of all US occupations in the next 2 decades. This projection was completely audacious, I think, but in a few cases, it probably didn't go far enough. For example, the authors named psychologist as one of the jobs least likely to be, quote, computerizable. But some research suggests that people are more honest in therapy sessions when they believe they're confessing their troubles to a computer because the machine won't pass moral judgment. Google and WebMD already may be answering questions once reserved for one's therapist. This does not prove, of course, that psychologists are going the way of the textile worker. It only goes to show that computers can very easily encroach on areas once considered for humans only. This fear, of course, of technology replacing people is so far from new. In the midst of the Great Depression, around the same time that Keynes made his audacious and wrong prediction, President Herbert Hoover received a letter warning that industrial technology was a, quote, Frankenstein monster that threatened to upend manufacturing and devour our civilization. That note came incredibly wonderfully and ironically from the mayor of Silicon Valley. But after 300 years of innovation, people aren't massively unemployed or indentured by machines. But to suggest how this might change, some economists have pointed to the defunct career of the second most important species in US history, the horse. For many centuries, people created technologies that made the horse more productive and more valuable, like plows for agriculture and swords for battle. One might have assumed, merely extrapolating from what we knew, that you would see a continuing advance of complementary technologies that would make the animal ever more essential to farming and fighting, which were, for many millennia, perhaps the two most consequential human activities. Instead, we got inventions that made the horse obsolete: the tractor, the car, the tank. After tractors rolled onto the American farm in the early 20th century, the population of horses and mules began to decline steeply, falling 50% by the 1930s and a whopping 90% by the 1950s. Humans, it goes without saying, are not horses. We can do more than trot and carry and pull. But the skills required in most offices hardly elicit our full range of intelligence. Most jobs are boring, repetitive, and easily learned. The most common occupations in the United States are retail salesperson, cashier, food and beverage server, and office clerk. Together, those four jobs employ 15.4 million people, 10% of the labor force, and about equivalent to the working population of Texas and Massachusetts combined. Each is highly susceptible to automation, according to the Oxford University study. When you add together all the taxi drivers and limo drivers and Uber drivers and truck drivers, you get a cumulative occupation category of driving, which is the single most employed male activity in America. And we've all read the headlines of automated vehicles. The story that I'm painting thus far, I think, can sound like a doomsday, a simple doomsday. But the future is rarely simple, and in fact, some people don't think it will be anything like a doomsday. They somewhat welcome our robot overlords. I spoke with a small group of writers and academics and economists who have been called the post-workists. They welcome, even root for, the end of labor. They say our society has an irrational belief in work for work's sake. And they have a good point. A 2014 Gallup report of worker satisfaction found that as many as 70% of Americans don't feel engaged in what they do every day. Indeed, if a cashier's job were a video game, grab an item, scan the barcode, slide the item forward, repeat, critics of the video game would call it mindless. But when it's a job, we feel obligated to praise its intrinsic dignity. Purpose, meaning, identity, fulfillment, creativity, autonomy. All these things that positive psychology have taught us are necessary for well-being are often absent from the average job. So the post-workists are certainly right about some important things. Paid labor does not always map to social good. Raising children and caring for the sick is essential work, and these jobs are compensated barely at all, if at all. In a post-work society, they said, people might be able to spend more time caring for their families, for their neighbors. Pride could come from our relationships, not our careers. After all, they say, if the most common occupation in the economy is drivers and salespeople, cashiers, food and beverage workers, office clerks, today's work hardly stretches the bounds of human imagination and potential. What if we let machines do all the tough jobs, the boring jobs, and use their productivity to find something more meaningful for us? One scholar I spoke to pointed out that the word school comes from the Greek word for leisure. We used to teach people to be free, he said. Now we teach people to work. Work itself is a small word that means three big things. First, work is the production of the world. It is the smelting of iron, the sewing of socks, the making of Snapchat. Second, it is income. It is the means by which we make money, the only means. Third, and this is the part that people often forget, it is purpose. Studies show that for many people, it is harder to recover from the trauma of long-term unemployment than from the trauma of losing a loved one. That might sound crazy, but it's true because people tend to recover from terrible events by immersing themselves in a distracting routine. When you lose your job and you cannot work, you are cut off from the very thing that offers solace to the worst sufferers. A routine, a means of losing yourself, a means of creating something that is larger than you. For this reason, work sometimes makes us happier even when we feel miserable doing it. In 1989, the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi conducted a famous study of Chicago workers and found that people at work often wished they were somewhere else, and people who were at home were often seemed to be happy there. And yet in questionnaires, these same workers reported feeling better and less anxious in the office or at the plant than they did in front of the television. These two psychologists called this the paradox of work. Many people, they said, are happier complaining about the jobs they have than luxuriating in too much leisure. We're often very happy watching Netflix, but we're not proud of having done it for 10 consecutive hours. Contentment, of course, speaks in the present tense, but something more in life, meaning, tends to come from a reflection upon past accomplishments. This raises the question, if machines displace more of today's work than we have to do, might it create work that people simply want to do? Again, I think the future may be a reprise of the past. Artisans made up the original American middle class. Before industrialization swept through the US economy, many workers who didn't work on farms were blacksmiths and silversmiths and woodworkers. And these artisans were ground up in the machinery of mass production in the late 19th and early 20th century. But Lawrence Katz, an economist at Harvard, sees the next wave of automation returning us to this age of craftsmanship and artistry. The internet and the cheap availability of artistic tools has already empowered millions of people to produce culture from their own living rooms. The demise of the formal economy could free up many would-be artists and writers and craftspeople to devote their time to creative interests, to live essentially as digital cultural producers. Such activities might offer virtues that are absent in the average job: independence, a chance to develop mastery, a sense of connection with a consumer base or an audience, and a sense of purpose. One theory holds that people tend to see themselves in one of three categories: jobs, careers, or callings. Individuals who say their work is just a job emphasize they're working for money rather than aligning themselves with some higher purpose. Those with pure careerist ambitions tend to look not only for income but also for status and renown from their peers. But one pursues a calling, not for the pay and not for the status, but for the intrinsic fulfillment of the work itself. In my reporting trip to Youngstown, I met a man named Howard Jesko, who was in college when the steel industry collapsed in the 1970s. Howard was this large guy with a big head and hands that were massive and soft, like huge mittens. He was planning on working in the steel industry, and that dried up. And then he worked in services, and he was fired from that job right around the time the Great Recession hit. And it wiped out so many people's savings, including some of his families. And at this point, Howard is in his 50s or so, and he does a really surprising thing. He goes back to school to get his master's. And you'd think someone with kids who goes back to school after quitting their job in his 50s, that person is presumably gunning for a rather practical degree, like engineering or maybe marketing. But Howard got his master's in American history because he wanted to be a teacher. His final paper was on the legacy of Andrew Jackson. And what's interesting to me about Howard's story is that if everything had gone right for Youngstown, he would be retiring today. But instead, his community suffered a recession upon recession. He was laid off from his job, And the outcome of all this grief is that he's fulfilling his lifelong dream to become a teacher. And it took all of these failings for him to pursue the work he always wanted to do. I've been turning over on this theme a bit in the last few days, the art of making good a potentially bad situation. And there's a poem that I couldn't help but think of. It's one of my favorite poems in the English language. It's by Alfred Lord Tennyson. It's called Ulysses. And the piece is most famous for its rousing conclusion, in which, in perfect iambic pentameter, Tennyson somewhat lovely summarizes the purpose of work: to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. But my favorite line is in the middle, and it goes like this: all experience is an arch, wherethrough gleams that untraveled world, whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. I don't know what that meant to Tennyson, but what it means to me is that all work, all accomplishment, even all failure, ultimately becomes a frame, an arch, to show us the things we haven't done, to reveal the untraveled world. And it implies that no matter how much you accomplish, the sum of your accomplishments will only serve to remind you of what's come next. And at first, I think this can seem like a very depressing message, a violation of the very idea of progress. It suggests that no matter what you accomplish, you will still have the same anxieties and fears and self-doubts and human weakness you have now. And you cannot flip a switch to let the light of joy chase away the darkness. But I like this quote because it says to me that fulfillment and happiness and purpose, you cannot buy these things. You have to fall in love with the process of trying to find them. The future of work is as unpredictable as the future of everything else in this country. It will be a struggle. It will be work. But that's the point. Thank you.